They called her children a curse. 5 of them, born on the same night under the same full moon, their cries rising together into the dark sky like a single terrible howl that woke every wolf in the Ironmoor territory from their sleep. The elder women had pressed their hands over their mouths. The elder men had looked away. And Marcus Vane, the man who had promised to love her, the man who had placed his mark on her shoulder and whispered forever into her hair, had taken one look at the 5. Small faces wrapped in rough cloth, and said the words that would define the next 3 years of her life. He said, "I cannot be part of this." And then he left, just like that. As if she were a door he had simply decided to stop walking through. 3 years had passed since that night. 3 years of mornings that began before the sun and ended long after it set, of porridge stretched thin enough to feed 5 small mouths, and sometimes nothing left for her own, of mending the same worn blankets, until the fabric barely remembered its original color. 3 years of stepping to the side when pack members walked the common path, of lowering her eyes when the council elders passed, of teaching herself to become small enough that people might simply forget she existed and leave her and her children in peace. It had almost worked. Almost. Except that children, real children, living and breathing and utterly indifferent to social hierarchies they were too young to understand, refused to be. Invisible, especially these 5. The pack said they were cursed. Not loudly, not anymore. Because even the cruelest people in Ironmoor understood that saying such things too clearly in front of a mother who had no one to answer to could produce an unpredictable response. But they said it in the way that mattered more than words. They said it in the space left around Nora at the market gatherings. They said it in the way invitations to celebrations never quite reached her cottage. They said it in the careful way other children were steered away from her 5, with soft murmured excuses about different playgroups and unsuitable influences, as though wildness and bad luck might be contagious. Nora had learned to hear the silence between words better than the words themselves, and the silence said over and over, "You do not belong here," and neither do they. It was Isolde who told her first, on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, when the air had just begun to carry that particular sharpness that meant the cold was coming. Isolde was standing at the cottage window in her nightgown, her golden eyes wide and fixed on something in the distance, and she said, in the perfectly serious voice she had been using since she learned to speak, "There is a very large wolf coming, Mama. He smells like thunder." Nora had looked up from the bread she was attempting to make last another 2 days and said, "Wolves do not smell like thunder, love." And Isolde had turned to look at her with an expression of patient correction that no 3-year-old had any business wearing and said, "This one does." If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. "You should keep the children inside today," Berta said, settling into the cottage's single good chair with the authority of someone who had been sitting in it for decades. "When the king's party arrives, there will be a great deal of formal posturing, and formal posturing does not mix well with young children who do not understand that they are supposed to be impressed." Nora glanced at her 5, who were currently engaged in some complicated negotiation over the last piece of bread, involving elaborate gestures, and at least 2 different languages that appeared to be of their own invention. "I understand the wisdom of that advice," she said. And then Finn looked up at her with his quiet eyes and said simply, "We want to see the Thunderwolf." "Mama." Nora opened her mouth, closed it, looked at Berta. Berta lifted her hands in the universal gesture of, "This is not my problem." Isolde appeared at the garden gate approximately 4 seconds later, Rowan, Petra, Soren, and Finn arrayed behind her in ascending order of reluctance, all of them still in the clothes they had been wearing, when Nora specifically instructed them to change into better ones. "We need to go see," Isolde announced. "No," Nora said. "We need to," Isolde said, with a weight on the word need that made it mean something other than desire. Nora looked at her eldest daughter and felt, not for the first time, that peculiar sensation of being assessed by someone who understood something she did not. "We are staying inside," she said, in the voice that meant the conversation was finished. Isolde looked at her for a long moment with those impossible golden eyes. Then she turned and walked back toward the cottage with the dignity of someone choosing to comply for reasons of their own, rather than because they had been told to, and her 4 siblings followed. And Nora stood in the garden for another full minute before she realized her hands were shaking. She told herself she was being foolish. She went inside. She did not hear them approach. The king's party was larger than she had expected. 6 guards in formal black and silver, 2 advisors with the look of men who processed information for a living, and then him. She knew it was him before she looked up. She knew it the way she had known he arrived earlier, through that same indefinable shift in the fabric of whatever the air between people was made of. She looked up, because not looking up was no longer a choice her body was willing to make. And she found herself looking at a man who was, objectively, the most physically imposing person she had ever been within 30 feet of, which said nothing useful about him as a person, but was simply a fact her eyes reported before her brain could apply any useful filter to the information. Caspian Drave was tall in a way that was not merely a measurement, but a quality, as though height were something he carried rather than simply possessed. His hair was dark, shorter on the sides and longer on top, and his jaw had the particular architecture of a face accustomed to being looked at without giving much away in return. He wore the formal attire of the royal house without appearing to be wearing it, which was to say it looked less like clothing, and more like a secondary skin. Present, because it was practical, rather than because anyone had required it of him. His eyes, when they found hers across the distance between them, were the color of deep water in winter, a gray so dark it was almost black, and they had the quality of eyes that had spent a great deal of time looking at complex problems and a relatively small amount of time being surprised by anything. He was surprised now. She could see it. She had become, in 3 years of watching faces for the information that the words attached to them did not carry, very good at reading the precise texture of surprise. And what she saw in Caspian Drave's face was not the polite startlement of a man who had rounded a corner and encountered a stranger. It was something deeper and less controlled than that, something that moved through his expression like a current through still water, disturbing the surface in a way that was immediately and efficiently suppressed, but not before. She had seen it. She looked away first. This was reflex and survival, and 3 years of learned behavior all operating simultaneously. She looked back down at the water containers and said, to her 5, in a voice she kept carefully level, "Stay close." And then Finn, because Finn had always understood the world through some system of perception that did not include the social calibration the rest of her children were slowly developing, walked directly toward the Alpha King, stopped, approximately 2 feet from him, and looked up. The guards moved. They were professionals, and the movement was immediate and practiced, bodies positioning between the small child and the king, with the smooth efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this category of unexpected contact. Nora was moving before they completed the motion, crossing the distance in 3 steps with her heart doing something in her chest that was not quite a normal heartbeat, and she said, "Finn, come here. Please." Her voice was steady. She was moderately proud of that. Finn did not move. He was looking up at the Alpha King with his quiet eyes, and the Alpha King, who had raised one hand slightly to signal his guards into stillness, was looking down at him with an expression that Nora could not read at all, which frightened her more than any expression she could have read. "He is 3 years old," Nora said, addressing the king directly because addressing anyone else in this situation was a form of pretending it was not the situation it was, and she had stopped pretending things approximately 3 years ago. "He does not understand rank or protocol. I apologize for the disruption." She reached Finn and put her hand on his small shoulder, felt the warmth of him through the fabric of his shirt, the absolute solidity of him, this child who had arrived in the world so quietly and had been making her heart work harder ever since. She was about to guide him back toward his siblings when the Alpha King spoke. What is his name? It was not entirely a question. It was the way powerful people asked things they expected to be answered, with the question mark present as a courtesy, rather than a genuine uncertainty about whether they would receive the information they were requesting. His voice was lower than she expected, and it did something to the air around it, a quality of resonance that she felt rather than simply heard. "Finn," she said, because there was no reason not to answer. "Finn Vane." The king looked at her then, fully, in a way that was categorically different from the quick assessment that most people performed when they looked at Nora and found her uninteresting, the kind of look that arrived and departed in the same motion like a hand testing a surface and finding it unremarkable. This look stayed. It moved through her face and settled somewhere near the center of it and remained there. And the sensation was so unexpected and so completely unlike anything she had experienced in 3 years that she almost stepped back from it. "And the others," he said. And she realized that his gaze had moved past her to where Isolde, Rowan, Petra, and Soren were standing in a row near the water containers, watching the scene with the collective focused attention of small people who understood that something significant was happening without being able to articulate what it was. "My children," Nora said, and she heard, underneath the words, the particular note that parents carry when they are simultaneously fiercely proud and braced for judgment. "All 5. She met his eyes when she said it. She did not look down. She had trained herself out of looking down when people said things about her children, because looking down was a form of agreement she refused to give. Something moved in Caspian Drave's expression, something too quick and too internal for her to name. He looked at her 5 children, standing in their slightly worn clothes with their wild, dark hair and their impossible golden eyes, and she watched him do the thing that almost everyone who looked at them did. The process of observation, followed by assessment, followed by some conclusion that they kept to themselves, but that she could read in the quality of their subsequent stillness. Except the conclusion he reached appeared to be different from the one most people reached, because instead of the familiar narrowing, the careful social withdrawal, the micro-expressions of discomfort and something closely adjacent to superstitious unease, what she saw in the king's face when he looked at her children was something she could only describe in the privacy of her own mind and with full awareness of how improbable it was as recognition. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. Alpha Rennick arrived with the energy of a man who had been managing a crisis for 24 hours and had just discovered an additional dimension of the crisis he had not previously accounted for. He was a competent alpha, Nora had always thought, in the particular way of leaders who understood that the vast majority of governing was unglamorous logistics, rather than dramatic decision-making. And he had treated her, over the years, not with warmth exactly, but with a basic fairness that she valued because it was rarer than it should have been. He arrived now with 2 of his senior wolves, and the quality of his arrival told her everything about how unexpected this scene was to him. The slight widening of his eyes when he took in the arrangement of people at the water point, the king, his guards, the advisors, and Nora Vane with her 5 children. "Your Majesty," Rennick said, and the formality was perfect. Years of political navigation, producing exactly the right tone of respect, without servility. "I apologize if the settlement's residents have caused any inconvenience. The afternoon water collection is a standard task, and I had not thought to alter the schedule." He glanced at Nora with a look that was not unkind, but was clearly requesting, with some urgency, that she use this opening to collect her children and depart. She began to do precisely that. She was reaching for the water containers, marshalling her 5 with the low-voiced efficiency of long practice, when the king said, still looking at her, "No inconvenience." And then, to Rennick, without the quality of his attention actually shifting away from Nora in any meaningful sense, "Who is this?" The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds, In those 2 seconds, Nora watched Rennick perform a very rapid internal calculation. She could see it moving through his face. A man who understood politics assessing how to accurately describe a woman who existed at the complicated intersection of pack member, social liability, and entirely unclear relevance to the Alpha King's inquiry. "Her name is Nora Vane," Rennick said. "She is a pack member, a widow." He used the word widow because it was the kindest available designation for her situation. She understood that, and she did not correct it. Her family lives at the north edge of the settlement. Caspian looked at Rennick with the expression of a man receiving information and sorting it against information he already possessed. "Is that all?" he said. Rennick paused for precisely the wrong length of time. "Yes," he said. Nora was quiet on the walk back to the cottage. Her 5 were not quiet. 5 small people rarely were, and she was grateful for the noise they made because it gave her somewhere to put her attention. That was not the conversation currently running on a loop in the back of her mind. Isolde walked beside her and kept looking up at her with those golden eyes that had always seen more than they had any right to see. And she did not say anything, which was unusual enough for Isolde that it registered. When they reached the cottage, and she had shepherded everyone inside, and begun the business of the afternoon, the bread, the water, the small repairs she had been putting off, the management of 5 energetic, small people in a small space, she let herself think about it properly. The formal dinner was that evening. She was not invited, obviously. She was present at the edge of things in the way she was always present, aware of the event, the way she was aware of weather, something that affected her environment without requiring her participation. She could hear, faintly, the sounds from the pack house, conversation and the particular register of formal social interaction overlaying the normal sounds of early autumn evening. She put her children to bed with the usual rituals, the stories and the songs, and the small negotiations over blanket territory that were a nightly production in the cottage. And when all 5 were finally quiet, she sat in the single good chair with a cup of tea and allowed herself, for the first time in a long time, to simply sit, without doing anything. She was still thinking about this when someone knocked at her cottage door. She did not move immediately. She sat for a moment holding her cup with both hands, running through the practical options. Berta sometimes came by late when she had information she considered too time-sensitive for morning delivery. Alpha Rennick occasionally sent someone with administrative communications. Both of these felt insufficient to account for the particular quality of the knock, which had been precise and deliberate, and somehow authoritative in a way she was only aware of in retrospect. She set down her tea and crossed to the door and opened it, and then she stood very still. Caspian Drave was alone. He had changed from the formal attire she had seen him in earlier, which registered as slightly surreal, the Alpha King in a plain dark sweater and trousers looking for a completely irrational moment, like an ordinary person standing at her door. He was not an ordinary person. Nothing about the way he occupied space was ordinary, and nothing about the quality of attention he was directing at her, measured and careful and somehow simultaneously completely focused, was ordinary. "I know this is irregular," he said, which was such an extraordinary understatement that she almost laughed, and she would have, except that she was too busy processing the fundamental strangeness of the situation to access humor. "May I come in?" She should have said no. She was aware of this. With complete clarity. He was the most powerful wolf alive, the Alpha King, and he was alone at her door after dark. And she was a woman of no status with no political protection, and every reason to be cautious. And the correct answer, the safe answer, the answer that every instinct trained by 3 years of careful social navigation was recommending, was to say no, and to ask him to return at a proper time through proper channels, and to close the door and begin processing this development from behind the safety of a wall. She said, "Yes." He sat in the chair across from hers. She remained standing for a moment because standing gave her the minor tactical advantage of being the person who controlled the physical parameters of the space, And then she recognized that she was thinking in tactical terms about the Alpha King sitting in her cottage, and she made herself sit down because the alternative was to stand here performing a kind of defensive readiness that would only make both of them uncomfortable. She sat. She wrapped her hands around her now cold cup of tea. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Your children," he said. And then he stopped. And she had the unusual experience of watching a person with the authority and presence of Caspian Drave search for the next word and fail to immediately find it. "What about them?" she said. Her voice was steady. She was getting better at steady as the evening progressed. "They are unusual," he said finally, and she felt the familiar gathering of herself that preceded a defensive response to any commentary about her five, the internal bracing, the careful controlled drawing together of all available composure. But before she could say anything, he continued. "I mean that in the precise sense of the word, not as a judgment, as an observation. Their eyes." He paused again. "In my family's records, there are accounts of wolves who carried the old blood, the original line from before the pack divisions. Wolves whose children were born with eyes like that. The texts describe it as a marker." He looked at her directly. "Not a curse, a marker." The word landed in the silence of the cottage and stayed there. Nora was aware of several things simultaneously. The sound of her children breathing in the small room beyond the curtain, the cold of the teacup between her palms, the specific quality of the night air coming through the gap at the bottom of the window she kept meaning to seal before winter. She was also aware that her heart was doing something it had not done in 3 years, a kind of movement that was not quite hope and not quite fear, but was in the territory where both of those things lived, the territory she had sealed off and stopped visiting because she could not afford what it cost to travel there and come back empty-handed again. "A marker of what?" she said. "Of a bloodline older than any currently recognized pack," Caspian said. "In the texts, the children of this line were always born. In multiples. Always with golden eyes, and always with the capacity for gifts that the standard pack hierarchy does not possess." He was watching her carefully, the way she had watched people carefully for 3 years, reading the space between her words for the information they did not carry. "Your former mate. He was not of this line." It was not a question. "No," she said. "Then the blood came from you," he said, "though you yourself do not show the marker." She thought of the thing she had never told anyone, not even Berta. The way she sometimes knew things before she should know them. The way she could feel the emotional state of her children as clearly as she could feel her own breathing. The way the world occasionally seemed, in certain lights and at certain angles, to be slightly more transparent than it should be, as though there were another layer of it visible just beyond the surface of the ordinary. "I am aware that I am different," she said carefully, "in ways that I have learned not to discuss." Something in his expression shifted. Not the recognition she had seen when he looked at her children. Something more personal than that, more immediate. "How long have you known?" he said. "Since before the children were born," she said. "The pregnancy changed things, made them stronger. I assumed it would pass after. It did not." She looked at the cup in her hands because it was easier to look at than his face, while she said the next thing. "I thought for a while that the elders might be right about the curse interpretation, not for the reasons they gave, but because I could not understand what else would explain why my children were born carrying something that would make their lives so much harder." She paused. "I have had 3 years to arrive at the conclusion that the explanation matters less than what you do with it." She looked up. "So, if you have come here to tell me what explanation the royal family's texts offer, I appreciate the information. But what I need to understand is what you intend to do with it. Because whatever it is, it involves my children, and that means I need to know." Caspian Drave looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to recognize. the one he produced when she said something he had not anticipated, and was internally reassessing the terrain he was navigating. He had the particular quality of a person who was accustomed to being the one who possessed information others needed, and who was encountering, perhaps not for the first time, but with some freshness. A person who responded to information not with relief or gratitude or fear, but with further questions. "I came here," he said, "because I needed to understand what I felt when I saw your son this afternoon." He stopped. A muscle moved in his jaw. "I have governed 17 territories for 11 years. I have walked into pact disputes and border conflicts and succession crises. I am not a person who is easily surprised or easily affected." He looked at her steadily. "When your son walked up to me this afternoon, I felt something I have not felt in 34 years of life. I felt like something that had been wrong had suddenly become right. And I do not have a rational explanation for that. And I dislike not having rational explanations for things, so I came to find one." The silence stretched between them. Outside, an owl called once and was answered by nothing. "And have you found one?" Nora said. "Not entirely," he said. "But I suspect the beginning of one." He looked at her with those winter water eyes, and she felt, in the very center of herself, the thing she had been keeping sealed and dark and undisturbed for 3 years begin to move, slowly, carefully, like a creature waking from a very long sleep, blinking into a light it was not entirely certain it trusted. She did not speak. Neither did he for a moment. And then he said, "I need to stay in Ironmore for 3 days to complete the territorial assessment. When the assessment is finished, I would like to speak with you again." A pause. "With your permission." She looked at him for a long moment. "You are the Alpha King," she said. "You do not require my permission for anything." "Nevertheless," he said, "I am asking for it." She was quiet for 3 full seconds, which was long enough to be noticeable, and she let it be noticeable, because she had spent 3 years being rushed past and overlooked, and made to feel that her presence was an inconvenience, and she was not going to allow herself to be rushed now. Not even by him, not even in the privacy of her own response to something she was not yet fully processing. "You may speak with me again," she said, "when the assessment is finished." He nodded once with the slight formality of a person who does not bow easily, but recognizes when a gesture of acknowledgement is appropriate. He stood, and she stood because not standing would have been strange, and he moved toward the door, and she followed at a distance that was not quite the following of a person seeing a guest out, but was more the following of a person who needed to be near the thing that was walking away from her, for reasons she was not examining too closely. He paused at the door. He looked at her once more, and she had the strange sensation, brief and vertigo-inducing, that she was looking at someone she had known for a very long time. "Your children are not a curse," he said. "Whatever else." "You have been told. They are not that." He opened the door and walked into the dark, and Nora stood at the threshold for a long time after he was gone. Serena Voss arrived on the 2nd day. Nora did not know immediately who she was. She knew she was someone significant the moment she entered the settlement, because the quality of attention the pack directed at her had that particular electric quality that only attached to people who arrived with the full weight of political consequence. She was beautiful in the way of people who understood beauty as a tool and had learned to use it with surgical precision. Her hair was the color of dark honey, and her clothes were flawless in the way that required both money and the knowledge of how to spend it, and she moved through the Ironmore settlement with the practiced ease of a person who had never once had to wonder whether the space she occupied would accommodate her. She had brought 3 attendants, and they followed her like a careful arrangement of implications. Nora saw her from the garden. She did not stop what she was doing. She turned the soil and noted, in the peripheral way she noted most things now, that the woman was heading toward the pack house, and that her arrival was clearly expected because Alpha Rennick came out to meet her with the particular combination of welcome and wariness that characterized his interactions with anyone who could complicate his existing political situation. She thought briefly that the woman was perhaps connected to the territorial dispute, some representative of the Caldwell pack sent to negotiate or to apply pressure. She returned to the garden and put the thought aside. Berta came that afternoon with the information Nora had not asked for, which was characteristic of Berta, and which Nora had learned to receive without comment. Serena Voss was the eldest daughter of Alpha Theron Voss of the Northmere pack, and she had been in informal negotiation with the royal house for the past year regarding a political alliance formalized through a mating bond. She was, in every practical sense of the term, the person most likely to become the next queen. She had arrived early, before the expected conclusion of the territorial assessment, because, Berta's sources suggested, someone had sent word to Northmere that the king was spending time in Ironmore that could not be accounted for by the official schedule. Nora listened to all of this with her hands wrapped around her tea, and her face arranged in the expression she used when receiving information that required processing before response. "She is here because of the king," she said. "She is here," Berta said, with the careful precision of an older woman who had witnessed many things and knew the difference between what was said and what was meant, because someone told her she should be. Nora nodded. She thought about this. She thought about the cottage visit 2 nights ago, and the way he had said, "I am asking for it." And she thought about what it meant that she had allowed herself to feel something in response to that. And she thought, with the cold clarity that she had cultivated as a survival skill over 3 years, about what the arrival of Serena Voss actually changed. The answer was everything she had been allowing herself to almost feel, and nothing she had actually decided. The second conversation with Caspian was not private. This was not what either of them had discussed, but it was what circumstances produced, because by the 3rd morning of the territorial assessment, the information, or some version of it, had made its way through the pack in the way that information always traveled through packs, selectively, partially, with embellishments added at each retelling that made it simultaneously more dramatic and less accurate than the original. What the pack knew, or believed it knew, was that the Alpha King had visited Nora Vane's cottage after dark on the first evening of his stay. What the pack made of this was a range of things that Nora declined to think about in too much detail, but which she could read clearly enough in the quality of the looks she received on her morning trip to the water point. A mixture of shock, speculation, and in some cases a confused reassessment that was in itself a small kind of indignity. Serena Voss found her at the market gathering. Nora had taken the children because the market was one of the few regular occasions that produced enough variety and stimulation to keep 5 energetic small people manageable without requiring active entertainment, and because she needed certain items and deferring necessary tasks was not a category of solution she permitted herself. She was at the grain seller's table, calculating precisely how much she could afford and how long it would need to last, when she became aware of a presence at her left shoulder that had the particular quality of a presence that intended to be noticed. She finished the calculation, completed the transaction, and turned. Serena Voss was even more beautiful up close, which was the kind of observation that was not useful, but was simply accurate. She was looking at Nora with the particular expression of someone who has already made a thorough assessment and is now delivering the conclusion of it. Her attendants had arranged themselves at a slight distance, close enough to witness, far enough to maintain the pretense that the encounter was between equals rather than a communication being issued from a significant height down to a significantly lower one. "You are Nora Vane," she said. "I am," Nora said. "The king mentioned you," Serena said, with a carefully calibrated warmth that felt like a knife wrapped in silk. "He mentioned the children." She looked at Nora's 5 with an expression that was almost impressive in its neutrality, the face of someone who had learned to look at things she found distasteful, without allowing any distaste. To register visibly. Almost. Nora had spent 3 years reading the micro-expressions of people who were trying to hide what they thought of her family. "He is a thorough man," Serena continued, and she was still looking at the children with that too neutral expression. "And he feels a responsibility toward any pack member who has experienced hardship. It is one of the qualities I most admire in him." She returned her gaze to Nora, and the warmth was still there, perfectly calibrated, warm enough to pass as genuine in quick assessment, cold enough to read clearly if you were paying attention. "I wanted to introduce myself so that when the king speaks with you today, as I understand is planned, you are not, She paused. The pause was deliberate, confused about the context. Nora looked at her. She kept her own expression the careful neutral that 3 years of practice had made nearly automatic. She thought about what this moment was, which was a woman who was afraid and was handling the fear by establishing territory, which was something Nora understood from the inside out. She thought about what the correct response was. She thought about her 5 children standing slightly behind her, listening with their various qualities of attention. Isolde with her assessing eyes, Finn with his quiet stillness, the twins with their shared vigilance. "Thank you for the introduction," Nora said. Her voice was perfectly level. "It is useful information." She gathered her grain, gathered her 5, and walked away without looking back, which was harder than she would have liked, and more successful than she had expected. Caspian was waiting at the cottage when she returned. This was not what she had expected. She had expected, if anything, a message delivered through Alpha Rennick requesting her presence at some neutral location at a formal time, the kind of meeting that allowed for appropriate preparation and the management of whatever this was through proper channels. Instead, he was at her gate, alone again. No guards. And he looked at her when she came around the path with a directness that had entirely abandoned the measured quality she had noticed in him before, and now had the quality of a man who had been doing something difficult for several hours and was close to stopping. "Serena spoke to you," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Nora said. She was watching him carefully. He looked, she thought, like a man in the process of making a decision he had already made, but had not yet allowed himself to complete. "I want to explain the situation," he said. "You do not need to explain anything to me," she said. And she meant it. She truly meant it. Because she was not a person who demanded explanations from people who owed her nothing. And whatever the past 3 days had been, it did not constitute the kind of relationship in which explanation was owed. "I know I do not need to," he said. "I want to." He looked at her steadily. "Will you let me?" She opened the gate. She settled the children with the afternoon activities that could be performed at the table, drawing for Isolde and the twins, the sorting game that Rowan enjoyed with great seriousness, the stacking blocks that Finn could occupy himself with for moderate stretches, and she made tea and brought it to the 2 chairs without asking whether he wanted it, because making tea was something to do with her hands, and her hands needed something to do. He waited until she was seated and then he began. And she listened with the particular quality of attention she gave to important things. The attention that did not interrupt, that absorbed everything and sorted it later. The arrangement with the Voss family had been in discussion for 14 months. It was a political agreement first, and a personal one second, which was the honest assessment rather than any statement about Serena as a person, who was, he said, intelligent and capable, and had been treated unfairly by his own. Prolonged uncertainty about whether he could go through with it. The uncertainty had been present from the beginning, but he had managed it as a logistical problem, because logistical problems had solutions, and this one would have a solution when it was finally implemented. And the political benefit was real, and the alternative, which was to select a mate based on the mate bond that he had largely concluded was not going to arrive for him, was not practical governance. He had been 34 years old, and he had made peace with what he believed his life would contain. And then he had come to Ironmore for what he expected to be a 3-day territorial assessment. Nora was quiet for a moment after he finished. She looked at the table surface, and she thought about what he was saying, which was a great deal more than the words he had used to say it. And she thought about Serena's face at the market and the way the woman had used the word confused with such precise intention. And she thought about her 5 children in the next room, the sounds of their afternoon activity so familiar and so fundamental to her life that she heard them the way she heard her own breathing. "What you are describing," she said carefully, "is not simple." "No," he said. "It has implications that are not just personal," she said. 14 months of negotiation between 2 major pacts, a political alliance that people are depending on. "Yes," he said. "And you are telling me this because," she said, and she let the sentence end there, because she needed to hear how he would complete it. "Because I need you to understand that what I said 3 days ago about wanting to speak with you again was not something I said casually," Caspian said, and his voice had a quality that she had not heard in it before. Something stripped of the careful authority, something closer to the sound of a person speaking without a script they had prepared in advance. "And because I need you to understand that the situation you just described, the implications, the alliance, the months of negotiation, I am aware of all of it. I am the one who will have to navigate all of it. And I am still here." He looked at her. "I am still here because I walked into this territory 3 days ago as a man who had made his peace with what his life would contain. And then your son walked up to me with no fear and no protocol and no understanding of rank, and he looked at me like he already knew me. And I felt, in that moment, like the entire shape of what I had made my peace with was wrong." His jaw tightened slightly. "I am not a man who decides things quickly and then changes them. I am a man who makes very careful decisions after significant deliberation. But I know what I felt, and I know what I feel when I look at you." The tea was cold. Outside the window, the afternoon was beginning to lean toward evening, the light going golden and lateral in the particular way of autumn, touching everything. With equal warmth, regardless of its status, or its history, or its situation. Nora thought about all the things she should say. She thought about being a woman of no status, and a woman with 5 children, and a woman who had spent 3 years becoming very realistic about the world and what it offered her. She thought about Serena Voss and a 14-month negotiation and the political machinery of 17 territories that required its Alpha King to function as a unit of governance, as well as a person. She thought about all of this with great thoroughness, and she thought about it for precisely as long as it took her to also acknowledge, quietly and without drama, that for the first time in 3 years, she was sitting in her cottage feeling not careful and not defended and not braced for the next thing, but simply present, simply here, in a way that was almost unbearably good. "I have 5 children," she said. "I know," he said. "They are not an afterthought in my life. They are my life." "I know," he said again. "If you are still here next week," she said, and she heard something change in her own voice, some quality she had not allowed it to have for a very long time. "Then we will have another conversation. But first you need to go speak with Serena." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Tonight." A beat. "Yes." He stood. She stood. They looked at each other across the small space of her cottage, and she felt the thing she had been feeling since the first moment she had looked up from the water containers. The thing she had been rigorously declining to name settle into something specific and definite. The way a word settles into the correct sentence, and suddenly the whole thing makes sense. He left. She sat down. She put her face in her hands for exactly 30 seconds. Then she heard Finn's quiet voice asking if dinner was nearly ready, and she stood up and answered him and began making dinner. "If you want to see how this story ends, Make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. What happened next moved faster than she expected, and slower than she feared. The meeting between Caspian and Serena lasted most of the evening. Nora did not witness it, and was not told about it, but she felt its progress the way she felt most significant events in her proximity, through the changed quality of the air, through Berta's appearance at her door at 7 a.m, with the expression of a woman carrying information of considerable weight and uncertain delivery. "The Northmere match is dissolved," Berta said, before she had even sat down. "He dissolved it last night." She set a bundle of herbs on the table, with the unnecessary precision of someone using a small task to process a large feeling. "Alpha Voss will not be pleased." "No," Nora agreed. Serena was in the guest quarters until very late. The guards heard raised voices. Berta looked at her carefully. Whatever the king told her, she did not receive it with grace. Nora said, "Nothing." She poured tea for both of them, and they sat with the morning quiet and the information settling around them like dust after something significant has moved through a space. The third day of the assessment ended with a formal meeting at the pack house. Nora was not part of it. She was at the cottage with her 5, moving through the ordinary motions of the day, the meals and the learning exercises, and the small productions of 5 young lives, and she was doing it with a quality of attention that was slightly different from her usual quality of attention, a kind of heightened aliveness to the texture of things, the warmth of Finn's hair when she smoothed it back, the particular laugh that Petra produced when Soren surprised her, the way Rowan sat for a full hour with a collection of smooth stones he had found, arranging and rearranging them with the methodical patience of a small person working out a system the rest of the world had not yet provided him. She noticed all of it with more precision than usual, and she thought, with the particular clarity that comes from standing at the edge of something changing, that she had been doing this wrong for 3 years. Not the loving was never wrong, but the attending. She had been attending to her children as a practice of endurance rather than a practice of presence. Today she was present. Caspian came that evening. He came without guards and without the formal attire, and he sat in the chair across from hers. And he was quiet for a moment before he said anything, which was a quality she was coming to understand was characteristic of him. The man who thought before he spoke, who treated silence as a legitimate part of communication, rather than a gap to be filled. "The assessment is concluded," he said. "Ironmore is in good standing. The border dispute will be mediated through the standard channels, and I have given Rennick the documentation he needs." She nodded. She waited. He looked at her with the winter water eyes. "I need to return to the royal seat," he said. "Tomorrow." She nodded again. Something in her chest made a quiet movement, a kind of careful adjustment, the reorganization of something that had been beginning to lean in a direction that now required the reassessment of its structural support. "I understand," she said. "I want to return," he said. "In 3 weeks, with an official delegation." He paused. "I want to present a formal invitation for you and your children to visit the royal territory." He watched her face. "As my guests. As people whose presence I am requesting not for political reasons, or assessment reasons, or any reason other than the reason that I want you there." He paused again. The pauses were doing a great deal of work. "And I want, if you are willing to continue the conversation we began this evening, the one about what happens next. The thing inside Nora that had been waking slowly for 3 days, the thing she had been keeping carefully, restrained and qualified and surrounded by appropriate caution, made a sound very much like the deep breath you take when you have been holding one for a very long time. "You want to continue the conversation," she said. "Yes," he said. "Knowing what it involves," she said, "meaning the territories and the politics and the 1,500 years of royal succession protocols that governed who could be queen and under what circumstances, and with what implications for the governance of everything under the crown. Knowing all of it," he said. She looked at him. She thought about the last 3 years, and the 3 days before that, and the moment when Finn had walked up to a man with all the authority in the world and looked at him without any fear. And she thought about herself, standing in the garden with shaking hands, feeling the electric certainty of something about to change. "Then yes," she said. "We will continue the conversation." He left the following morning. She stood at the cottage gate with her 5 arranged around her, and they watched the king's party depart along the northern road, the horses moving at a steady pace in the clear autumn morning. Finn was on her hip, and he watched the departing party with his quiet eyes, and then he said, into the air, with the uncanny confidence he had always produced when making statements that turned out to be accurate, "He is coming back." "Yes," Nora said. "He is." Isolde, standing at her left, took her hand. Nora looked down. At her, at the golden eyes that saw too much, and Isolde looked back up and said, "Good." That was all. Just good. Nora squeezed her hand. They stood there until the party disappeared around the curve of the road, and then they went inside, and Nora made breakfast, and the day continued, ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure. The 3 weeks were harder than she expected. He sent word on the 20th day. Not a formal letter, not through official channels, but a personal message brought by a single writer who handed it to her directly and departed without waiting for response. The message said, "I will arrive in 2 days. I have been thinking about a question, and I would like to ask it in person. I hope the children are well." She read it 3 times. She thought about the phrase "I would like to ask it in person" and what kind of question was formulated over 20 days and then required personal delivery. And she thought about this with full awareness of the possibilities and her own vulnerability to each of them. And she put the message in the drawer of the small table beside her bed and told herself to sleep. She did not sleep. He arrived on a morning when the frost had finally committed and the ground held its cold like a decision. She saw the party approaching from the window, and she made herself wait inside, because going to the gate was a form of running toward something, and she had made a policy of not running toward things until she knew what they were. Isolde had no such policy. Isolde was at the gate approximately 30 seconds after the party came into view, and from the window, Nora watched her 6-year-old daughter, who had never been afraid of anything she had decided did not deserve her fear, stand at the gate in the cold morning in her coat and her impossible golden eyes, and look at the approaching Alpha King with the expression of someone confirming information they already possessed. Caspian saw her. Even at distance, Nora could see the moment he registered Isolde, and the way something in his bearing changed, softened, was not quite the word, because he was not a man who softened exactly. Opened was closer, the way a room opens when a window is unlatched. Nora met them at the gate. The formal part came first, as it always did with Caspian, the acknowledgement of Alpha Rennick, the brief exchange of necessary political courtesies, the documentation the delegation had brought regarding the border mediation. She watched him do this from a few feet away, and she noticed, as she had the first time she watched him navigate official context, the quality he had of inhabiting the role completely while being simultaneously and clearly a person, rather than just a function. He returned his attention to her when the formalities were concluded, and he looked at her with the directness she had come to think of as his, specifically his, the look that did not perform assessment, but actually performed it, the look that said, "I am genuinely looking at you and not managing the impression the looking creates." "You look well," he said. "You look like a man who has been thinking about a question for 3 weeks, she said. And something at the corner of his mouth did what it did when she said something that surprised him, a slight movement that was not quite a smile, but was in the same family. The children arrived in order of age and boldness, Isolde first, then Finn, then the twins together, then Rowan last with the measured approach of someone who had decided this was worth full attention, but was not going to give it at the cost of his dignity. Caspian greeted each of them with the specific kind of attention that Nora had noticed. Most adults were not capable of giving to small children, the kind that treated them as complete people rather than small versions of people. And she watched her 5 respond to it with the instinctive recognition of beings whose primary experience of adult attention had been exclusion. And she felt something happen in her chest that was very large and very quiet, and not entirely comfortable to hold. They walked together while the delegation settled into the guest quarters that Alpha Rennick had provided. She had sent the children with Berta for the morning, which Berta had accepted with the expression of someone who had been expecting to be asked. They walked along the river path that bordered the eastern edge of the settlement, and the frost crunched softly under their feet, and the air was cold and clear, the kind of cold that sharpened everything rather than dulling it. He did not begin the question immediately. They walked for a while in a silence that had the particular texture of 2 people who have established, over a brief and intense period of time, a relationship to silence together, a kind of comfort with it that does not require filling. She let it be comfortable. She had earned comfortable silences. "When I was 20, he said finally, I asked my father what it felt like to know he had found his mate. He said it felt like the world becoming more legible. Like a language he had always been hearing but not quite understanding, had suddenly clarified into something he could read. He looked at the river. The winter light was moving on the water in long, flat plains. I was 20, and I thought that was the most impractical description of anything I had ever heard, and I filed it away in the category of things adults said that were technically true but not useful. He paused. I have thought about it every day for 21 days. She said nothing. She waited. I have spent 11 years governing territories, he said. And in that time I have made thousands of decisions that had to balance what was right against what was necessary and what was possible, and what was politically sustainable. I am good at this. It is not a thing I say with pride. It is a thing I have learned to do, because I had to. He stopped walking. She stopped. They faced the river. And I have made the decision about the Voss alliance, and I stand by it, and I know what it costs in political terms, and I have a plan for those costs. But I need to ask you something that is not a political decision. He looked at her then, and his face had the particular quality she was beginning to associate with him, in the moments when he set down the governance and was simply himself. The face of a man who was intelligent and capable, and slightly lost in a way that moved her more than she could. Explain. Will you let me court you? Formally. With the intention that is implied by the word formally. The frost was on the grass, and the water was moving, and the sky above the bare trees was the particular shade of blue that existed only at the exact edge of winter. Nora thought about the years and the loneliness, and the 5 small people who were her entire world, and the man standing beside her who had looked at all of it and said, I am still here. She thought about what it meant to say yes. The full weight of it, the political implications and the protocol and the impossible social distance between the alpha king of 17 territories and a widow of no status in a small pack at the edge of his governance. She thought about all of these things thoroughly, and with her full attention, and then she thought about Finn's voice on the morning Caspian left, saying he is coming back with the uncanny certainty of a child who simply knew. Yes, she said. It was a small word for the size of the thing it carried. Yes, you may court me. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the river moved beside them in the cold winter light, and something that had been wrong for a long time, for longer than she could measure, became right. Serena Voss returned. This was not expected by anyone, including, Nora suspected, Caspian, though he processed it with the contained efficiency he brought to all unexpected developments that had political dimensions. Serena arrived on the 4th day of the courtship period, accompanied by a formal delegation from Northmere and carrying documentation that presented, in the careful language of political maneuvering, a counter-proposal. She had spent 3 weeks at home and she had used them well. The counter-proposal involved territorial concessions from Northmere that would be genuinely valuable to the Crown, a restructured alliance that did not require a mating bond, but provided most of the political benefits of one, and a formal grievance. Regarding what she characterized as the disruption of the previously agreed arrangement, which had sufficient legal standing in pack law to require official acknowledgement, she was not wrong. The documentation was thorough, and the legal standing was real, and it was, Nora understood, a sophisticated play by a sophisticated woman who had correctly assessed that the direct approach had failed and was now pursuing the structural one. Nora learned about it from Caspian himself, which was characteristic of the new quality of their interaction, a quality she was still learning to accept, the quality of being included in the information that affected her. They were at the river path again, which had become theirs in the way that certain locations become specific to certain relationships, carrying the accumulated weight of the conversations that have taken place along them. He told her about the documentation clearly and without minimization, and she listened with her full attention. And then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What do you want to do?" He said, "I know what I want to do." She said, "But," he said, "but the counter-proposal has real value, and the grievance is legitimate. If I dismiss it without acknowledgement, I set a precedent that political agreements can be dissolved without cost when personal preferences change, and that precedent is dangerous for governance." She thought about this. "Then acknowledge it," she said. "Process the grievance properly, assess the counter-proposal honestly, and make the decision that is right when all of the information is considered. That is what governance is." He looked at her. "You are describing a process that could end differently from the way you would prefer it to end." "I know," she said. "I am describing the process anyway." He looked at her for a long moment with the winter water eyes. "You are the most unusual person I have met in 11 years of governance," he said. "I will take that as a compliment," she said. "It was," he said. On the 14th day, Caspian requested a formal gathering of the pack. Nora dressed her children in their best clothes, which were not the best clothes available to most members of a royal gathering, but were clean and well-mended, and did not apologize for themselves. And she dressed herself in the one garment she owned that was both practical and not entirely without dignity, a dark blue dress that she had made herself from fabric Berta had given her 2 winters ago and which fit her well because she had made it to do so. She braided her hair back. She looked at herself in the small mirror for a moment, and she thought about the woman she had been 4 weeks ago and the woman she was now. And the difference between them was not the dress or the braid or the fact that the Alpha King of 17 territories had asked to court her. The difference was that somewhere in the last 4 weeks she had stopped looking at herself like she was a person who had survived something, and started looking at herself like she was a person who was living something. The gathering was held in the open ground before the pack house. The entire Ironmore pack was present, along with the royal delegation and the Northmere delegation that had arrived with Serena, and the quality of the assembled group had the specific tension of people who had been told something significant was going to be said and were now trying to prepare themselves for every possible version of significant. Nora stood with her 5 at the edge of the gathering, not in the front where prominence would have been, not in the back where invisibility was, but in the middle, in the place that said, "I belong here," without claiming more than was yet confirmed. Caspian stood before the gathered pack with the particular quality he had when he occupied official space, the quality that was both utterly natural and entirely intended, the quality of a man who had been moving through power his entire life and had learned to wear it without letting it wear him. He spoke first about the territorial assessment, the findings, the mediation plan for the border dispute, the documentation that Rennick would receive. This was governance, clean and competent, and the pack listened with the attentiveness they gave to information that directly affected their safety. Then he paused, and the quality of the silence changed. "The counter-proposal from Northmere has been reviewed and assessed," he said. The territorial concessions offered are genuine and valuable. The restructured alliance has merit. The legal grievance was properly filed and has been formally acknowledged. He looked at the Northmere delegation, at Serena, who was standing very still with her perfect face arranged in an expression of controlled waiting. The counter-proposal is declined. The silence that followed this had a quality Nora had not heard in any silence before. The specific soundlessness of many people simultaneously realizing that the thing they expected to be impossible was apparently not. The decision to dissolve the original arrangement was correct and will not be revisited, Caspian said. The governance of 17 territories requires its Alpha King to be effective, to be trustworthy, and to be honest. The most honest thing I can tell this gathering, and the most relevant to the governance of what I am charged with, is that I know what I felt when I came to Ironmoor, and I know what I feel now, and I know that the effectiveness and trustworthiness I owe to every wolf under my governance requires me to begin that governance with truth rather than political convenience. He looked at the gathering. Then his eyes found Nora and stayed there. I came to this territory to conduct an assessment, he said. I found something I was not looking for. I intend to pursue it with the full intention that such things deserve. He walked toward her. She was aware, in the acute way of moments that exist at the exact center of a life, and will be remembered in full detail for the rest of it, of everything. The frost under her feet, the cold air, the 5 small bodies around her, warm and present and completely still, in the way they only became when something enormous was happening. The sound of the gathering, which was not silence but was not speech either, a collective held breath. Serena's face at the periphery of her vision, which she did not look at, but was aware of with the particular awareness you had of things you were choosing not to focus on. The way the morning light moved. The sound of her own heartbeat, which was doing something it had never done before. Something steady and enormous and entirely certain. Caspian stopped in front of her. She looked at him. He looked at her and then at her 5. Briefly, warmly. The look of a person acknowledging that what stands before them is a complete thing, and they are approaching all of it. Then he looked back at her. I said I would ask my question in person, he said quietly, just for her. Though the gathering was watching with the combined attention of 100 wolves whose social understanding was in the process of being entirely reorganized. I have conducted the process that the governance required, and what remains is the question that is not a political decision. He was close enough now that she could see the details of his face, the particular quality of his eyes, dark and deep, and carrying what she had spent 4 weeks learning to read as the specific look of a man who had decided something and was not going to undecide it. Nora Vane, he said, will you be my mate? The question was not a surprise. She had known the shape of it for days, had felt it coming with the particular anticipatory awareness that had been growing since autumn. What was the surprise? What she had not prepared for, and could not have prepared for, was the feeling that came with hearing it said, aloud in front of this gathering, this pack that had spent 3 years treating her and her children as a cautionary tale, rather than as people, the feeling of being seen and named and chosen in the most public and irrevocable way available. She felt her children's presence around her, Finn pressing quietly against her left side, Isolde at her right, with the golden eyes taking in every detail, the twins and Rowan completing the small constellation of people who were her entire world. The people she had built her life around, and for whom she had endured and continued and kept herself from breaking for 3 years. She thought about all of it. She thought about how much it weighed and how much it was worth, and what she was about to say, and what it would mean. Yes, she said. Her voice was clear and steady, and carried in the cold morning air. Yes, I will be your mate. Caspian reached for her hand and she gave it to him, and she felt, the moment their hands connected, the thing she had been told her whole life was a mythology, a story told to the young to make the world seem more ordered than it was. The mate bond. It moved through her like sound through water, from the point of contact outward, through her arm and her chest, and the base of her throat and the back of her skull, warm and certain and impossibly right, the specific rightness of her father's description brought back after 21 days. The world becoming legible. She heard from beside her Isolde say something, in a language that was not any language she had ever taught her daughter, something ancient and melodic and entirely certain, and she looked down at her eldest child to find all 5 of them lit from within by something she did not have words for, their golden eyes burning like small suns in the cold morning air. The pack witnessed it. Every wolf present witnessed the mate bond taking hold, witnessed the light in the children's eyes, and she watched the understanding move through the gathering. In waves, one after another, as pack members who had called her children cursed, confronted the visual evidence that they had been looking at something ancient and sacred and entirely misread it for 3 years. She watched this without triumph, because triumph required the existence of an opponent, and she had never been fighting anyone. She had simply been trying to survive long enough for the truth to make itself apparent. She felt only the particular cleanness of a long misunderstanding being corrected. Serena Voss left that afternoon with the Northmere delegation. She left with dignity, which Nora respected, the dignity of a woman who had played a real game with real stakes and had lost it fairly, and knew how to depart with her head up. Nora watched her go from the cottage gate and felt nothing toward her that was less than human, because she understood what it was to reach for something and not receive it. And that understanding did not require a common history to be real. The ceremony required them both to speak their intentions before the assembled representatives of the 17 territories, the formal declaration of the mate bond, the acknowledgement of its permanence, the ancient words that had been spoken in this hall for generations to make official what the bond had already made real. She spoke her part without hesitation, and heard him speak his with the particular quality of voice he had when he meant something completely, not the governance voice, not the measured political voice, but the voice of a person delivering the most accurate information they possessed. When it was done, and the hall acknowledged it with the formal response that 3 centuries of tradition had prescribed, she felt the mate bond in her chest resonate like a note struck on an instrument tuned exactly right. Her children had been given formal places in the ceremony. This was not traditional. It was something Caspian had arranged because, he said, when asked about it with a directness she now understood was her default mode with him, and which he had come to respond to with the same, because they are the reason I came to Ironmoor, and the reason I am standing here. And there is no version of this ceremony that is complete without them. Isolde stood on her left. Finn was on her right. The twins and Rowan were in the front row of the assembled witnesses, given formal positions by the royal staff with the gravity that attached to all formal positions in this space. She looked at all 5 of them at the moment the ceremony was confirmed, and she saw in their faces the particular expression of children who have arrived at a place they have been waiting to reach, the expression of completion rather than conclusion, something that was ending, because it had been looking for this moment all along. The announcement came at the end of the ceremony, from the royal herald who had been conducting proceedings, delivered in the formal language that made certain things true, by the act of being spoken aloud in this room before these witnesses. The words announced the mating of the Alpha King, the name of the woman who was now his mate and by that bond his queen, and the formal recognition of 5 children of the blood, the old blood, the blood the records had documented and the history had anticipated, as members of the royal household, with all the standing that entailed. The hall was quiet for a moment. Then it was not quiet. They called her children a curse, Isolde said beside her. She had not expected her daughter to speak, and she looked down, startled, to find Isolde looking not at the hall but at her, with those golden eyes that had always seen too much and had always been right about what they saw. What will we call them now, Mama? Nora looked at her daughter. She looked at her 4 other children, and she looked at the hall and the witnesses and the mate whose hand was warm in hers, and she felt the answer rise in her without effort or calculation, the truest thing she had thought in a long time. Ours, she said. We will call them ours. The hall completed its acknowledgement. The sound rose and filled the ancient space to its rafters and carried outward through the stone walls into the winter morning, and every wolf in 17 territories who was attending to the quality of the day felt something shift in the governance of their world, something becoming more legible, something that had been almost right, becoming exactly right at last. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?